All right. Well, hi, hello, and welcome to Defeating the Specters of Ransomware. Okta and AWS shine a light on cyber resilience. Now, today's exciting webinar is sponsored by Okta in partnership with AWS and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Jess Steinbach. I'm with Actual Tech Media, and I am so happy that I get to be your moderator today because this is the perfect pre-Halloween spooktacular event, right? We are going to get into all the scary stories, all the boogeymen and the things that go bump in the night. But better than that, we will talk about how we can defeat these villains, these threat actors, these ghostly specters. And we have a great chat ahead of us. I cannot wait to dive in. So whether you're in the Halloween spirit or not, you will get something interesting from this webinar, I promise you. And I want to get all of you interactive and involved. I want to hear from the wonderful crew of humans we have here with us today. I can see some highs and hellos coming in already. We've got Jason and Ed Ghouls. Hello, Ghouls and Boils, says Jason. Oh, Jason's in the spirit. I love it. Yes, bring on the Halloween puns, my friends. I've got Ed, we've got Greg, we've got Edward, we've got John, we've got Juan, we've got Steven, we've got Gilbert. We have a whole awesome crew with us. Please keep those highs and hellos. Please keep those Halloween puns. All of your stories and ideas coming in today, and especially your questions. We want to hear from you as we go through our day together today. So if you haven't found that questions window already, it's right in your console. There's two tabs there. There's a handouts tab and a questions tab. Click on the questions tab and send in those highs and hellos right now. Give a little wave to the community here with us. Now that's also where you're going to send in all your questions, all your comments, all your insightful ideas as we go through our session. And not only are our speakers going to be taking a few questions at the end, we'll do some live Q&A. They're also going to be answering questions on live chat throughout their conversation. How's that for multitasking? They're going to speak and write simultaneously. I can sometimes do one of those things. I don't know if I can do both at once, but I believe in our speakers. They're going to get some information your way over that live chat. So keep those questions coming in. Now, if you do have any technical issues today, if the ghouls and gremlins get into your tech system and something is not working for you, the first thing you're going to try is a browser refresh. That is your first line of defense against the goblins that are with us. You're going to try that browser refresh. If that doesn't work for you, you're going to post in that questions window, let our team know, and we will be there to help you out. So browser refresh first, and then post in the questions window. Let us know how we can give you a hand. All right, that's the questions window. Let's take one hop over to the handouts tab. This handouts tab today is so full of cool resources and takeaways. It is the ultimate trick or treat basket, just stuffed full of whatever your favorite candies are. Like if you're a Reese's Pieces person, it's all Reese's Pieces. If that's not your jam, what's the one? I don't like Smarties. There are no Smarties in that handouts window. It is pure Starburst and Reese's Pieces. That's the best of the best, in my opinion. Feel free to battle that out with me in the questions window. But all that good stuff happening there in the handouts tab. So make sure you've got those handouts and takeaways with you before you leave. All right, the last thing I want to tell you about is some prizes. As you can see, we do have a $250 Amazon gift card as a prize drawing at the end of our webinar. You do need to be here in live attendance in order to qualify to win that prize, and all winners must meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. If you're not sure what they are, remember that handouts tab I was just telling you about. One of the cool treats tucked away in that trick-or-treating bag is the terms and conditions. So if you would like to take a look at those, please head on over and check them out. We also have another prize for all of you. We have a $50 best question gift card. So today, what we're going to do, once we get to the end of our webinars, we're going to review all of the questions asked during our session, and we are going to pick the best question asked. And I can see from the crew here with us today, the competition is going to be fierce. So make sure you get those questions in. We will take a look at those, and we will send that $50 best question gift card out after we wrap up the webinar. Stay tuned for that. All right. Well, with that, as Jason has said, ghouls and boils, let's get into our session here today. I am so excited to introduce you all to our speakers. They are waiting in the wings, ready to get started. I'm going to bring them on out here with me in just a second. We will be chatting today with John May, Security Architect at Okta, and Anthony Harvey, Senior Security Specialist Solutions Architect, Amazon Web Services. So, John and Anthony, I know you guys are ready to rock. Let me get your cameras on with me here. Just one moment. We'll get started. All right. Well, Anthony, John, thank you so much for joining us today. I am so happy to be here with both of you on this spooktacular pre-Halloween conversation we're about to have. Anthony, I would love for you to start us out by introducing yourself. Tell us a little bit more about you, my friend.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Anthony Harvey. I'm a senior security specialist solutions architect with AWS. So my goal is to help customers with any sort of security challenges that they may have, architectural, procedural, or otherwise. I've been with AWS for a couple of years now, but I spent about 4 years in local government as a CISO and about 7 years in higher education before there. So definitely have a lot of experience dealing with some of the challenges that we see in security, and I love talking about it. And I know John does too, so I'll pass it over to John.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm John May. I'm a security architect here at Okta. I specialize mostly on the cloud enterprise and platform security side. Been at Okta about 4 years, and then before that, spent around almost 10 years at a large financial institution.
So a lot of experience coming in, and I love that we're starting with, a solid understanding of some of the challenges that folks in the audience might be facing. And maybe actually what I'd like to start out with, Anthony, is a little bit of that foundational question, though. Why should I care? We've got a lot of things to be worried about in this noisy world. Some of them are Halloween based, but most of them are with us all year round. So what do you think, Anthony? Why should customers care from that defense standpoint?
Yeah, because honestly, at the end of the day, threat actors, they don't sleep, right? It's always a constant and evolving thing, and security is everyone's responsibility at the end of the day. So being able to learn more about what's going on is incredibly important. And I talk with customers all the time about what they're seeing, but also what we're seeing from an AWS perspective. And at the end of the day, I want people to be able to learn from others. So as we go through and kind of talk about some of these stories, I think it's just really important to see what went right, what went wrong, or could be improved, and kind of learn from that, because those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, right? So we want to make sure that we're doing what we can.
Boy, isn't it ironic that I feel like we have to learn that lesson over and over and over again, and that we don't learn from history? We're just gonna go around. Yeah, I love that. I've been getting my light ready because we're gonna get into some scary stories. Okay, couldn't resist that. But we are going to talk about some scary real life stories, which I think is a great place to start out, because we're going to try to learn from some. We are going to take exactly what you just said, Anthony, and put that into practice. We are going to learn from history, and we are going to try not to be doomed to repeat them. And so that starts with some spooky campfire stories, some real life case studies, tales from the trenches. Anthony, you're going to kick us off on this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like the first place to kind of start off with is ransomware. It has not gone away. It's still top of mind for a lot of people because it's just super common. It's super prevalent. And I've spent a decent amount of time in the public sector, and we unfortunately see it in the public sector quite a bit, right? And just to make sure that everyone kind of knows what we're talking about when we mean ransomware, it's just referring to the business model where you have bad actors going in and trying to extort money from other entities. So one thing that comes to mind is a locality that I was talking with, and they got hit with ransomware. Obviously not fun. No one wants to have that phone call at 2 a.m. in the morning. But essentially what happened, right, they had some legacy software, something that unfortunately is fairly common in the public sector. And just a lack of vulnerability management was really kind of the root cause of the issue there. And like most public sector customers, it's a lack of money, lack of people, and lack of funds and resources to be able to do what you need to do and operate security effectively. And unfortunately, as a result, it took them quite a bit of time to get back online, just from a business continuity standpoint, but them also looking at the backups and making sure that the backups themselves are being trusted, right? That they can restore to a known good state, and also making sure that they're patching the way that the threat actor came in initially, right? I've seen that time and time again where someone goes back and is hit with ransomware, they restore from backups, but they don't actually fix the root cause. And so they just get hit again, right? So that's something that I really try to work with the customers to help eliminate that risk. But generally across the board, when I see ransomware scenarios kind of play out, it's either due to legacy software, poor permission management, right? So when we think about the concept of identity, right, and making sure that people have strong access management, that's something that generally we see in these scenarios, that there's too many permissions, right? Someone's able to move across the environment. I've worked with customers where an attacker will take 10 different hops within an environment before they're actually able to deploy their ransomware, but they're able to do so because they don't have that permission management there. And then lastly, the cultural education too, right? We're going to be talking a little bit about this over the course of this webinar, but being able to educate people around what the right things and the wrong things are, what they should be doing from a security hygiene standpoint, is just really, really important, especially when it comes to ransomware.
I love that. John, ransomware is obviously like the boogeyman and the thing that everyone is concerned about. Anything else that you would want to add to that particular campfire story?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, there's an interesting statistic from the Verizon data breach incident report where it basically mentions that when a system is compromised, about 70% of the time ransomware is installed. And I think that just speaks to the prevalence of that type of threat.
70% of the time. Yikes. Yeah, that's I mean, really, that is the boogeyman under the bed. That's just ubiquitous now when we talk about threat actors. Okay, so Anthony, I want to make sure that I've got this here. If we were giving sort of lessons learned, survival 101 to with ransomware, security hygiene was one I heard you say. That one I think is really, really important. What else?
Yeah, I mean, definitely having that security hygiene. Don't delay the basics, right? I think that's one of the big things when people are like, oh, we can't do this patch right now because something else takes priority. You really need to make sure that you are prioritizing security across the organization and bringing that to the beginning of any project, right? Shifting that security kind of left and having security at the very foundation of any new project or initiative is so important. Like I was working with one customer around their new ERP system, and they were building it into their budget 3 years down the road that they're going to be paying for this upgrade because they know that they need to do this to stay compliant with their internal policies, right? So really just kind of having that security in the beginning, and then also making sure that you have a good backup plan in place and that you test it. Backups that aren't tested aren't really backups. So please make sure that not just backing up your data, but making sure that you can restore it and restore it effectively and know what those good backups actually look like.
It's like an amen moment. Backups that aren't tested are not backups. I wanted to like golf clap for that one. Like, yes, that's a great takeaway. I love that. Okay. Anything else we need to talk about ransomware, John? Are we good?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Heck yeah, we covered it. Ransomware, check. We talked about that. Let's talk about. I want to talk about another biggie. I'm excited about this one because I have to say this is one of those ones that I feel like I sort of am aware of risk factors, but not sure I fully understand what's real versus what's hype. Anthony, talk to me about crypto mining.
Yeah, absolutely. And so another thing that threat actors are doing, of course, is trying to make money. In a lot of ways, they do that is through the concept of crypto mining. So essentially installing software on your work points, or your workloads, your endpoints, and mining cryptocurrency. And so I'll actually go ahead and bring up a quick demonstration because this is something that we actually launched at AWS. And we wanted to see what are threat actors actually doing to install crypto mining applications? What is actually involved and how quickly is this actually happening? So to kind of level set here, right, we spun up an EKS cluster, right, our Elastic Kubernetes cluster, and exposed it to the internet with a little misconfiguration. So at T-0, we have our cluster misconfigured to allow anonymous access. So definitely not a best practice, but we do see customers doing this, right? Mistakes happen. It is the people aspect of things, right? Their misconfigurations can occur. And so that's what we did in this scenario. Now, 9 minutes later, it was discovered by a generic scanner. So if you think about just the sheer agility that threat actors have now and how quickly they're trying to find new things to exploit, it is very, very fast. And honestly, on average, at least from the data that we get from AWS, we start seeing scans at about 30 seconds. So this one is a little bit slower than our average, but it just happens super, super quickly. And so what happened in this scenario after it was discovered by those generic scanners about 9 minutes in, about 45 minutes or so, it started to be targeted by Kubernetes specific exploits, right? So it understood that this isn't just an IP address floating out in the ether, but rather an actual Kubernetes cluster. And it was starting to look at the different APIs and different ways that it can actually escalate its privilege. And that's what happened essentially 4 days later, right? It took them a little bit of time to figure out where the secrets were stored, what information they can pull, kind of move laterally within the environment, right? And get that administrative privilege. And then once they did that, in about 10 hours, they started launching new pods to mine cryptocurrency, right? So that's really kind of the sheer volume of scans that we see, as well as how quickly the threat actors, once they identify something that's potentially vulnerable, how quickly they're trying to exploit it and make money, right? It's something that they realize that they're probably going to get caught at some point. So they're immediately trying to launch new cryptocurrency mining operations to get whatever money they can out of it. And especially due to the fact that a lot of it is anonymous, it's definitely a high priority and something that we see from a lot of threat actors. And honestly, this because it's kind of based off of misconfiguration at the very beginning, right? I really want to kind of stress to people that you need to adhere to best practices. You need to know that even if you're putting something up online that's like maybe a dev environment or whatever else, it's going to be scanned just as quickly. It's going to be looked at from threat actors just as quickly, right? And being able to make sure that you have kind of that secure by default, that you have those secure configurations at the very beginning. You kind of see the theme here. We're trying to shift everything left and trying to make sure that security is at the forefront, even when it just comes to the initial configurations of the workloads, or it's just so incredibly important. And actually, I think John probably has a couple of stories about that too, around how that kind of impacts things from a security perspective.
Yeah, for sure. And first, I just wanted to mention it's pretty eye-opening. The time to scan is within minutes, basically. If you so that's pretty eye-opening to me, for sure. So I guess along those lines, I do have one about the dangers of those vulnerabilities. So you've touched on that a little bit. Of like once an attacker gets in, they basically deploy ransomware, crypto mining. So I've got a story about Log4Shell. So I guess the first question is like, what is Log4Shell? It's basically a name for a vulnerability that affected Apache Log4j. It's a widely used logging library for Java applications. But just to use an analogy, imagine you run like a big business with lots of different departments and you want to know what's going on in each department. And so every time something happens, like a sale or a customer has a question, you want that recorded so you know how your business is. So that's basically what logging does and what that library would do. And so Log4j is like an automated assistant that's keeping this journal across your business. But instead of business events, it's like computer events. So like, are there the errors the application is experiencing, like information about how the application is performing, that sort of thing. And so I did want to show a little bit more technical place around like a simplified version of example of how Log4Shell could be exploited. So basically an attacker sends a payload with a malicious command to a vulnerable server. The vulnerable server accepts that command and then connects back to an attacker server to retrieve a payload. And then that vulnerable server then receives the malicious payload and executes it, right? So why is that dangerous? Well, the vulnerability is extremely dangerous, and how a vulnerability is, or how dangerous a vulnerability is rated using what's called the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS. Those scores range from 0, which means it's not dangerous at all, to 10, being the most dangerous. And so Log4Shell received a 10 out of 10, which is the maximum possible score. And so why was it a 10? So one reason is because it's classified as an unauthenticated remote code execution vulnerability. So what that means is basically from my computer at home, in theory, I can exploit that vulnerability on a computer, on someone else's computer anywhere in the world without needing access to that computer. So remember our analogy about the automated assistant that takes notes for a business? Now imagine that anyone who can be heard by the assistant can give the assistant instructions and the assistant will just do it. So like take all of the cash from the safe. So you can imagine how big of a problem that is for a business. And then another reason why it was also dangerous is because it's just extremely simple to exploit. It can basically be done with a one-line command. And then unrelated to its CVSS score, a couple of other reasons just to mention, it's ubiquitous. So like that software library is used everywhere, even places you wouldn't expect. And then because of how Log4Shell is exploited, it has the ability to affect systems that are downstream from that initial point of entry. So just to use that analogy again, like imagine I just yell into a room and someone repeats my message to the assistant later in the day, it would also be exploited. So yeah, and then I guess just to mention this, because this is that remote code execution vulnerability, when it's being exploited, the attacker can give any instructions that it wants. So like Anthony mentioned, ransomware, it could be crypto mining. Like those would be the next step in this vulnerability exploit. I guess, and then thinking through this a little bit is like, this was obviously a huge deal in a past life that required immediate action. But it could be very challenging to understand like if and how we were affected. So I'm going to go back to that analogy again. Like imagine that business is huge. It's got thousands of departments. What do I do? I need to know if there's an assistant in each department. Like, what do I do? Do I go and check each individual department? How long would that take? Is that even possible given the scale? Luckily, we didn't need to do that. We had automation and like tooling to do those checks for us. But that just illustrates sort of the dangers of vulnerabilities.
I just have this great image of you, John, with a bullhorn, like literally physically shouting through it. Like, did you log that?
Yeah, exactly.
Fail. Okay, so coming from that, obviously, and I think Log4Shell is a great example because it's something that was so well looked at and understood, and it's worth kind of exploring that as a really key example for that vulnerability exploit. So I learned this recently that the reason people like true crime is because they're watching and they're figuring out how they should survive. So they're like taking notes on how they would survive if they were the ones being chased down by that axe-wielding person that apparently is out there in the world. So if I'm listening to this axe-wielding story, what's my survival takeaway from Log4Shell and other vulnerability exploit stories?
Yeah, and I'll throw it over to Anthony if he's got some thoughts too. Like, I think the first one is visibility is everything. Like you need to know what's in your environment. You need to have an accurate inventory across your entire technology stack, from your infrastructure to your applications. Need proactive layered defenses. So like Anthony mentioned, attackers are actively scanning. So even while we're trying to respond, attackers are trying to exploit us. And then just a note would be like, security is really a team sport. You can't really forget that collaboration is key. And so responding to those types of large events really requires that coordination.
What do you think, Anthony?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's spot on. And I really think from a vulnerability management standpoint, it is so critical just to make sure that you stay on top of those things. I mean, whether it's through tooling like we have with Amazon and Specter or whatever vulnerability management solution that you want to go with, just being able to identify where it exists in your environment and how you're able to patch it, whether it's criticality or otherwise, is just really, really key. I mean, I was up at probably 2 a.m. With the teams like going through patches and everything when we saw that first come out, just because we knew how bad it was. Like John was saying, it was a CVSS 10. And so we were like, okay, we need to drop everything and make sure that we are protecting ourselves. And that's something that I would kind of take back to your organizations and say like, hey, are we able to respond to these vulnerabilities immediately, right? Do we have a plan in place or a playbook or run book to be able to do so?
Cool. And then I guess there's another vulnerabilities are definitely a problem. If I could lead into the next sort of story, there's another class of threats that are a little different, but have the same level of impact, which is misconfiguring your cloud environments. To do a quick callback to Anthony's story as well. So I've got more of a headline story for this. And in 2019, Facebook found itself in the headlines because they had a very large data set that was found publicly available on the internet, but Facebook itself didn't actually lose control of data. Instead, the problem came from third-party developers, basically companies or teams that create applications or services on Facebook. Those developers stored the data for their applications in like S3 buckets, basically the cloud storage service that can be used to upload, users can use to upload data. And S3 can store a ton of data. That's one of the big, that's why it's appealing. And where it went sideways for those developers is that they misconfigured their S3 buckets. So instead of setting the storage to private, so only they could access it, they basically left it wide open public. So anyone with that right URL could access the data, no password, just public access for all that information. And so in total, over 540 million records of Facebook were exposed. So it included things like your Facebook ID, which could, in theory, be tied to real names, account names, and your social media activity. So while it's not credit card information or passwords, it's a serious privacy risk for those for customers. The data in the wrong hand could make those customers more vulnerable to phishing and other social engineering attacks that use that sort of data. And I think just overall, it's much harder to gain trust than it is to lose it. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part.
Such a great human takeaway on that one as well. I think that's very true for all of us in our lives. Anthony, anything you want to add from the cloud misconfiguration stories that go bump in the night?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, at the end of the day, right, we want to make sure that people are securing things effectively. We have a lot of different ways that you can approach the configuration of your environment, right? If you're a media company, you probably need to actually go and broadcast all this information out of your environment. Everyone should be able to have access to it, and so on. If you are a federal agency, chances are that's probably not the case. You have the option to configure both, but being able to understand the organizational needs behind it and then determine what the right controls are to kind of align with your organization's risk profile is really the main thing behind it, right? And that's how you're able to really kind of reduce risk, because it's going to match the risk profile of the organization.
All right. So, John, what's our key survival tagline from that story?
Let's see. So I think only 2 or 3 things. So third-party risk is a big thing. So you really need to know, like Facebook or whatever company wasn't directly responsible for that data loss, and like the third-party developers were. So it's important to review and monitor the security practices of your vendors and partners in your entire ecosystem. I think also around secure defaults. So like as a company that builds products, it's I think for both of us, it's important that our products contain secure but usable configurations out of the box. And so we can still allow flexibility as needed, but want to make those choices intentional, explicit, and informed when customers make those.
Well, I think what we've sort of been dancing around here, a through line through all of these stories, there's the technical elements, and then under that and connected to that technical element is that always terrifying, always scary, chaotic, wonderful human element. And so this is, I need to work on my evil laugh. So when we're talking about the human element, the human sides of all of this, that's a huge part of everything that we've talked about. And we haven't gotten to dig into that as much. So Anthony, can you bring us home with a very scary story about the human element?
Let's see. It's funny that you bring up the human element, right? Because people, or at least the way I feel about it, people are our first and last line of defense. They're going to be the first person to see something, say something, but they are going to be the last person before everything goes sideways, right? So from a human standpoint, social engineering, I think, is still a really, really big topic, and something that we unfortunately still see all the time. And this one we're going to kind of take a different spin on this, because it's not really going to be a technical thing, right? We've talked about all the different ways that attackers are leveraging exploits and doing crypto mining. But at the end of the day, too, social engineering is such a big risk. And so one that unfortunately is more near and dear to me than I would like. We had a county that had someone call in claiming to be a large computer manufacturer. They were able to understand what orders were coming in, especially in the public sector too, with the Freedom of Information Act requests. There's a lot of ways that the threat actors will try to use open sets of data and do the reconnaissance to understand what organizations are doing. So they called into the county and they said that they were that computer manufacturer, that they have a new routing and account number, right? And that the new POs should be headed over to those new accounts. And I'm sure you could probably guess what happened after the fact, right? That was hundreds of thousands of dollars that got routed into the attacker's account, assuming that those county employees were paying a legitimate business when it wasn't. And so what happened there, there's no technology involved in that. There's no advanced exploit. That was someone who was essentially relying on the goodwill of a public sector employee, and they made that update that unfortunately cost quite a bit of money. And so from the people standpoint, right, when you think about that first and last line of defense, being able to think about like, okay, do we have a process associated with, let's say, verifying a new identity, right? Verifying a new bank account, right? When we think about being able to establish who it is on the other side of the line, is there a process to do so? And in security, I feel like we always say trust but verify, right? So trust the person that's calling in, but you need to verify. There might need to be a couple of extra steps involved. And when you have these processes actually fully played out, you're able to kind of iterate on top of them. So when you go through and you think about maybe a tabletop exercise or some other type of exercise around these particular events, you can look at your playbook and say, oh, we're missing this, or, oh, we haven't thought about this from maybe like a threat modeling perspective. So really kind of building that into the process and really leveraging that process, making sure that people can't bypass that, right? I think is one of the big things to kind of help reduce that social engineering risk.
John, anything you want to? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, that was. I like the tagline that both the first and last line of defense. I typically think of like the first line, so I will probably steal that. And it is very important, I think, to your point, to give. You really want to give your employees the tools and knowledge to make them successful too. They, by and large, folks want to do the right thing, and sometimes they just don't have, those things.
I feel like Anthony's given us all the like zingy one-liners today. We're getting some good. John and I are stealing all of your best lines, Anthony.
Go for it.
Perfect.
Okay, so I think that what I'm hearing and kind of wrapping that up, and really I think this sort of applies across a lot of these. You talked a lot about planning, and so I think making sure that you understand what the plan is and planning ahead, making sure that you know what those processes are. To me, that seems like a through line in all of these, but really in particular when we're talking about humans, because they are the wonderful side of things and they are a slightly chaotic side of, or a little entropic. Maybe there's always that tendency towards chaos. And the other one that's really ringing in my ears, Anthony, is the trust but verify. So those are really standing out for me. Anything you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, right, we want to trust people to an extent, but we also want to verify it. And I think that's also when we kind of think about the concept of zero trust and everything else, where you want to verify as much as possible before, especially when we think about traditional networks and things of that nature. You had kind of those trusted environments, but once you're in that trusted environment, people can kind of go anywhere. If you're in that trusted environment and an attacker is moving laterally, that can happen as well. If you're in that trusted environment from a phone call perspective and you're calling someone else and spoofing a number, right? We see all these types of things where if you have kind of that true process where you are verifying all of these critical steps, all these critical workflows, that you're going to help reduce that risk long term.
Yeah. Perfect. All right. Well, John and Anthony, I'm going to ask you guys to switch gears with me a little bit, because I feel like we've started with some of the, Halloween horror stories around threats and things that we consider in a broad and general sense. And now we're going to zoom in a little bit more towards some industries and start with some industry specific effects and things and considerations. So the two industries that we're going to talk about today, I think these are really important industries to talk about: higher ed and finance. Obviously, these are things that affect all of us, not just professionally, but personally as well. If you're a human living in this world, you are connected in some way to either higher ed or finance or both. So let's dig in a little bit to some of the industry-specific examples that you guys have seen and unpack those a bit. Anthony, I think you're going to kick us off with higher ed, and then we'll send it on over to you, John, for some finance talk.
Yeah, for sure. And so I spent almost 7 years in higher education at George Mason University. Go Patriots, if anyone's a fan there or an alumni. And there's a lot of challenges in higher education, right? When we think about the diverse user base, I mean, you're going to have multiple types of users. I was a wage employee, student, alumni, administrative faculty, all sorts of different designations, right? And they all have different types of permissions. They all have different types of access. And so really kind of dealing with the higher education aspect and the types of users that are there, as well as the turnover too, because turnover from a university's pretty much like a good thing, at least from a student perspective, right? When we think about people graduating, like, okay, great, they graduated, they're out into the world, and we are educating them and they're able to do what they're going to do. But you have that new incoming freshman class every year, right? And thinking, okay, we need to make sure that we have that entire identity life cycle kind of provisioned out. And then you also have the students bringing their laptops and their Xboxes and everything else, right? And then when you're thinking about all these devices that they're bringing onto your higher education network, how are you able to still allow them to do what they need to do, that they can still reach the resources that they need to reach, but do so in a secure way, in a way that reduces risk to the rest of the university or the college? And then you also have some of the regulatory challenges. And I think that was one of the big things for me, is that when you're in higher education, it's FERPA, right? It's GDPR, it's HIPAA, it's PCI, it's CGIS. You have research grant requirements, right? You are working in academic medical centers, right? There are all these different aspects from a regulatory standpoint that can all exist within the same university. And so kind of going through and working through some of those challenges while still dealing with things like legacy systems, right? We see that, of course, across the entire public sector, but you have some of those older systems that may not be able to be patched against Log4j right away, right? Or that may not be able to be updated right away. So really kind of going through all of those different challenges make it a really unique place to be in higher education. I mean, I loved it. It was a lot of fun. I still work with universities and colleges and school systems all the time on their security challenges, but it is a unique one. And it's something that I think will continue to improve and continue to evolve. But it is something where, going back to that security hygiene standpoint, a lot of these issues, a lot of these challenges really kind of go back to some of that hygiene, to some of that shifting security left, making sure that when you're launching that new project from a grant, that security is being built into part of that. And we're seeing that from like the federal perspective. We're seeing new grants having cybersecurity requirements as part of that grant, which is awesome. Obviously, I'm a huge proponent of it, but I definitely think it's just an evolving space.
Anthony, you said Patriots, but you meant Go Badgers. That's right, right? Is that?
No comment.
Certain fights out here, certain fights. Okay, so that's awesome. Love that. John, what do you got for us?
Just a comment on that on Anthony's mention around higher ed. It is really interesting to see how different industries have different risks and threats that they're worried about. I guess myself, having spent most of my career proud Okta in the finance industry, I've got I guess an interesting story that played out when I was in there, and it was even more interesting to watch it play out in real time. So I'll tell a story and hopefully illustrate sort of the things that we'd be worried about in finance. But this one's from 2017. Folks will probably remember this if you were in security at the time, but Equifax, which is one of the largest credit reporting agencies in the United States, had one of the most significant data breaches in history. So Equifax, for folks who don't know, basically gathers and stores a lot of sensitive personal information, like your credit history, your social security numbers, like account details, that sort of thing. And this data is used to help banks and businesses make decisions on loans and credit cards and other financial. And so what happened was attackers found a vulnerability in a piece of software called Apache Struts. Now, what Apache Struts does isn't real important for this discussion, but what is important is that there was a patch or a fix available, but it wasn't applied. And so that ultimately led to an exploit and a breach. And so the personal information for over 147 Americans were lost to the attackers, which meant like nearly half of all Americans were affected. And so, like I mentioned, these are things like your name, social security numbers, birthdays, addresses, like a lot of very important information that could be used to commit identity theft on a pretty massive scale. So attackers could open credit accounts or take out loans, or even apply for government benefits using someone else's identity. And so if anyone has been a victim of identity theft before, I have heard horror stories about how difficult it is to fix an address. So it's what I learned from that experience and just watching it unfold and having been in security at the time was like, think we've mentioned a couple times, but like patch management is crucial. Like you have to know what your software is, and you have to apply patches or upgrades as they're made available. Data minimization was also a pretty key point. So as a business, you should only be storing data that you need and no more. The more data that you store or have, the more risk you're taking on and the bigger target you are. And then another learning, I think, was just transparency and communication. So you want to make sure you have that clear crisis communication strategy so you can provide customers or impacted folks with like clear, timely, and actionable guidance for anyone affected. So
I think it's so interesting as I'm listening, and it's funny. I had a flashback, John, right as you were saying, the identity theft, and I was remembering the first time I'd heard those words, and it was my dad telling me to cross off like on mail. So like cross off and to shred. And I had this flashback to being a youthful human and shredding my mail for the first time and feeling really sad that was something I had to do. And now how that's expanded out into all of these areas and both of the industries that you just provided for us, as we kind of said, are part of our lives in human ways, as well as professional ways, as well as those of us in the security industry. And it's just wild, the level of aggressive growth and how much this touches every aspect of our lives now. I'm just feeling sad for myself now.
Oh, well, you're not alone. I have a Strider right here too. So, but it's really interesting though that, John, that you brought up the concept of data minimization, right? Because I feel like that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily consider when they think about the data lifecycle, right? Being able to expire data after a certain amount of time, because as data and storage becomes cheaper and cheaper, it makes it a little bit easier to kind of hold on to data for longer for that what if scenario if I still need it or whatever that may look like. But then at the same time, though, that is more data that potentially could be at risk, right? And so it's always kind of figuring out what is that balance between maintaining the data versus getting rid of it? What benefits are we getting from holding on to it? And does that outweigh the risk from holding on to it as well?
Yeah, totally.
Well, I like this, and where I feel like we're hopefully maybe getting into, because what we sort of tried to hit all the way through this is, yes, and I'm really in my Halloween vibe today and feeling ready for it. But like, so yes, there is an element of like sitting around telling those campfire stories, and there's something kind of fun about that, and there is an element of learning as we go through that. But I think also where we want to bring these to is getting into those solutions. And so, you don't know what you don't know. And so we have to keep having these conversations. We have to keep updating on trends and threat development and threat actors. And all of that is important. And that comes from conversations like these because it moves so quickly, right? So it requires this constant updating of our knowledge base and our understanding. And what I also think is really cool is the introduction of solutions that are coming out of partnerships. And this sort of idea of being stronger together and creating more innovations because we're working together and staying out in front of those threats and those threat actors. So that's where I'd like to go next, because I feel like we've done the doom and gloom, and now it's time for the rainbows after the scary stories. I don't think that's how campfires work, but we're going to go with it. So I want to start out, John, I'm going to ask you to spread a little rainbows and sunshine for us. And at the end of this very scary movie that we've all watched together, it was a little palate cleanser. So what is the better together? What is how we get out of our scary stories today? What's the positive spin you've got for us?
Yeah, sure. So I think overall, like Okta and AWS are really trying to build a world where employees and customers can safely and seamlessly use any technology powered by identity. And so I wanted to share one more recent story that I think does a great job at illustrating how that partnership is working. Let me share my screen one last time. So back on April 16th of this year, Cisco Talos released a blog post basically warning about large-scale brute force activity targeting specific VPN and SSH services. And then later on April 26th, Okta's identity threat research team released an advisory warning about a spike in credential stuffing attacks using residential proxies and anonymization services. So just some quick definitions for folks. Credential stuffing is an attack where the attacker attempts to sign in to an online service using usernames and passwords from previous data breaches. A residential proxy is when an attacker misuses legitimate users' network by routing their traffic through it without that user's knowledge or consent. And then anonymization services are such as the Onion routing project, if folks know that, or it's Tor. It basically hides where the attacker is coming from. And Okta provides many security features that automatically detect and block those types of attacks. But along those lines, just turning back the clock a few weeks, AWS also identified that brute force campaign and started rolling out some network mitigations to protect their customers against that specific campaign at the network layer. And then later, they even roll out some more generic brute force protections to provide even more broad protection against that class of attack. So,
yeah, and honestly, just to kind of follow up on that too, I mean, I think that's just a really, really cool story to tell, just because of how we see the same thing. We both are working together to kind of help reduce the risk of these intrusions actually occurring, right? And you saw it from what their threat research team is doing, what we do, right? And we have sensors all over the world that we're collecting all this data and feeding that back into our protections to help our partners like Okta reduce their risk being in the cloud and everything else. So I think it's just really, really cool to see how we both identified that same problem and we both worked to mitigate that risk for our customers, for our partners, and did so in a relatively quick way, especially when we go back and we think about how quickly threat actors are working, right? And that we are able to kind of iterate and build these things in quickly. And I know it's not necessarily even on the screen, but we were able to turn in these detections to protections and go live with it within about 24 hours, which I think is really, really cool. A testament to what our team is doing, but also a testament to the security that Okta gets to receive as being a part or being built on top of AWS.
That's awesome. Detections into protections is the next, and I love it. I love it. Anthony's got a lot of nice lines. I'm just writing them all down, man. That's awesome. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, I do want to stop because we're getting very close to the end of time and I want to get in a few audience questions before we wrap up. But I just want to make sure that we've really captured like how cool this partnership is and the innovation that it's providing for everyone out there and for the folks in the audience that are kind of excited to jump in. These types of partnerships, as we just said, are how we stay out in front of this fast growing kind of threat landscape. Any last kind of takeaways on the partnership that you would want the audience to really understand and walk away knowing?
I mean, I'll say from the AWS side, like I think identity is just so important. And I work with a lot of customers that are running Okta today, and just being able to see all the different integrations and the way that you're able to extend identity across AWS is just really, really powerful. And when we go back and we think about kind of the visibility that John was talking about earlier, when you have that visibility to see where the identity is occurring across the environment, that's going to help reduce your risk dramatically, right? And then I think that's something that everyone can kind of take away from it.
Yeah, I guess from our side, I mean, it's really all part of this layered defense, defense in depth, the partnership between AWS and Okta. I mean, there are things that you could be doing at all different levels to make sure that you're protecting both your business and your customers. So yeah, I think that's it. And we'll, I guess the other thing is we'll be at reInvent as well. So if folks want to come say hi, do it.
I love that personal invite to all of us. Go hang with John. We're all going. John's taking us all out for dinner. I might heard that correctly. Great. Yes. Okay. Amazing. And I'm going to ask you to say more on how to follow up in just a second, but let me sneak in a few audience questions because we're getting a ton. Now, I do want to say to the folks out there, I'm going to get through as many questions as we can. We've got about 10 minutes left, so we're going to have to move quickly. If we don't get to your question today, a reminder that we're going to make sure all the questions that you have asked get sent to Okta and AWS. So you are going to get answers back, even if we don't get into them today. So keep those questions coming in. Anthony, John, are you guys ready to get into, are you ready to be grilled by the audience?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Good. I will work on my evil laugh. It's not very good. Okay. Let's start with this one here. What's a good way to measure security maturity, especially around things like identity?
That's a good question. So I feel like maybe I'll give a public sector kind of spin on this, but one of the ways that we kind of approach it is through two things, right? The first being the NIST cybersecurity framework. I think that's something that even if you're not in the public sector, a lot of organizations follow, right? It maps to a lot of different frameworks. But when we think about the identify, protect, detect, respond, recovery aspect of it, it's really going to be able to kind of gauge where your security program is at and where it could be potentially in the future, right? And now they've added a new category called governance that kind of wraps everything together. And with that, right, it really kind of establishes how you do your security operations, right? What risks should you be looking for? How do you do your protection? How do you respond and recover in the case of ransomware, like we talked about earlier? So I think that's a really, really powerful tool. And then if you are building on AWS, for example, we do have our security maturity model as well. And that one's kind of broken into 4 different phases where you have your initial foundational phase all the way up to like your optimize and phase 4. And so those are 2 different ways that you can kind of really see where you're at, see where maybe you have room for improvement or where your gaps may be. And then you can kind of help close those gaps and help improve your security posture there.
Yeah, and the topic of maturing your security controls is near and dear to my heart. So I guess as part of that, I'm glad you mentioned the NIST CSF. I think that's a great framework. There's lots of industry frameworks that you could use to measure different aspects of your security program. I think at the concept level, basically what is very important to keep in mind is that you've got sort of your current state of where you are today. You've got where you want to be, which is typically defined by the framework that you're using. And then you have to draw a line to basically get from that current state to your ideal state or your target state. And that process is very important. I think just as you build out your security program and you measure your security maturity, including identity, and where the rubber meets the road a bit is once you've got that sort of roadmap, you have to actually execute on that roadmap and then continuously evaluate and assess your maturity as you progress. So it tends to be a multi-year journey, and it can be very challenging too.
Yeah, it's the iterative. It's so fun. You get like a nice plan and you're like, oh, that's a good plan. You put a bow on it and you're like, oh no, now I have to do all this.
Yep.
Okay, all right. That one went so well. I'm going to reward you with another audience question.
Let's go for it.
Let's try this one here. Oh, I like it. We've got a trend spotter, okay? Because we're getting near the end of the year. I know. And we're looking ahead. So question for you both. Where do you see identity changing or improving in the future?
Yeah, I guess I would see, of course, the passwordless is a thing. Like we want to get rid of passwords overall as much as we can or as much as is possible. So I think that's a big thing. I also would also mention that attackers are just getting smarter. So they're getting smarter about multi-factor authentication and ways to bypass that. So as an example, session hijacking. So that typically happens after you do your MFA. And so I think strengthening those adjacent security controls, like protecting sessions, doing things like device-bound authentication, like those types of changes and improvements across that whole threat model, I think is what you'll start to see.
And I think maybe to kind of follow up on that too, I definitely like the call out of like passwordless, and I think we're seeing some really creative ways to do authentication, and I definitely think that's going to continue to increase. I'll also say that given the explosion of AI, of course, we're going to have to bring that up. But when we think about identity and looking for anomalies of that particular identity and having all that data together, I think that's going to be something that's going to be really, really valuable from a risk perspective. So when we think about those suspicious logins, we think about you trying to access a resource that you have access to, but you haven't done that in a year, right? Then that should maybe fire off a red flag or whatever that may look like. I think being able to have all that data, being able to run machine learning and being able to spot those anomalies along with that identity is going to be really, really powerful as far as reducing risk for organizations.
We almost made it an entire webinar without talking about AI. I was getting nervous there. Uh-oh. If we have a webinar and nobody says AI, have we really webinared? I don't.
That's right.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, so we are getting very close to the end of time, and I'm going to live on the edge. I'm going to live dangerously. I'm going to sneak in one last question because this is something that we've danced around but haven't really gotten into, and that's zero trust. I love zero trust. So here's a question for you both. We've heard a lot about zero trust, but what is one practical first step that I can take in my organization to start moving our AWS environment in that direction? Anthony, give us a practical step for zero trust.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And with zero trust, I really want to stress that it's not the traditional binary decision, right? So before, you'd either have like network controls or identity controls, and that's what allowed you access to something, right? You would be on the corporate VPN, and now you have access to something, or you log in the username and password, now you have that. With zero trust, we're really trying to bring both of those together, and where you have your network-centric and identity-centric controls, and you use that information to make that decision as to whether someone should have access to it or not.
Mm.
And so as far as like a practical first step, right, when I talk to people about this, you don't necessarily need to boil the ocean when you start going through this. You can start building out and start testing these zero trust type of controls, the zero trust type of mentality, because it's not all just a technical solution either, right? It is a process driven one. And so really just kind of getting that, maybe that one test use case where we want to say, oh, we don't need to use the traditional corporate VPN for this. Let's try this application in a different way where we can bring in device posture, where we can bring in identity management and combine all that together to really give you that zero trust environment. So all that to say, don't need to boil the ocean. Take it one step at a time. But that first step is really just kind of walking through that door saying like, hey, if we're going to find this pilot application, we're going to find this pilot workload, we're going to leverage some of these tools and some of these processes that are out there to really kind of build out that zero trust environment.
Yeah, and I guess from my perspective, I guess my recommendation would be like, so zero trust can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. If I were to start anywhere, you could really just start just being a champion of that concept and evangelizing the concepts across the company, but starting with your security organization. I can imagine just doing simple things like defining what that is, pointing out examples where you could improve that, and really sort of building that critical mass of buy-in and at all levels, both at your peer and potentially management and beyond level. So just getting the ball rolling, talk about it, like more it comes up in conversations and is less of a buzzword, but is something concrete and actionable. I think folks will appreciate that, and you'll start to build sort of a consensus around next steps and what to do, and be seen as that sort of that voice for zero trust.
Yeah, really. And I think both of you kind of hit on like not just being like a checklist or a one-stop, shop, and more of that iterative and ongoing approach and process and environment and just a little bit more general than zero trust done. Which wouldn't that be nice if that was
Definitely
quick, easy magic answer. But okay, so it's our right at the end of time. We're going to have to wrap things up there. Like I said to all of you out in the audience, I'm so sorry that we're not going to take any more questions, but we are going to get answers back to you. So keep those questions coming in, and we'll make sure you get a response back. Before we go, we have some pre-Halloween trick-or-treat gifts for everybody in the audience. I'm really excited about. I actually don't love Halloween that much. I don't know why I'm so into it today, but it's coming. So okay, we have in our trick-or-treat bags for everybody in the handouts tab. There's some cool handouts and takeaways. Anthony, talk to us a little bit about follow-ups, about next steps, about kind of getting in, learning more after we wrap the webinar today.
Yeah, absolutely. So one, like John was saying, reInvent, be awesome. If you can swing by, that'd be great. But if not, there is also a link in there to an ebook around zero trust, right? And so I talked a little bit about a couple of those steps, but really kind of building and expanding upon that, where you're able to understand those base concepts, like John was saying, right? That we want to make sure that people are educated on what this actually means for the organization, but then also the implementation side of the house as well, being able to do that identity verification, device verification, and all that. So I think that is a really, really good place to kind of get started. And as you continue to adopt the zero trust mindset, that's going to help reduce a lot of the risks that we've been talking about, all these stories that we've been talking about from a ransomware and crypto mining and so on perspective. So definitely that would be my next step for everyone.
Read a little more. All right, John, other than coming for our free dinners with you at Reinvent, which I've now signed you up for, any other takeaways, next steps, things you'd love to see the audience kind of walking away thinking about or taking action on?
So I think just along the zero trust standpoint is like just keeping in mind that like bringing people along, I think is always super helpful with a lot of these conversations, especially within your organization. Try not to assume a lot of knowledge a lot of the time and just work together and partner well. And I think that you can just build that sort of partnership internally and affect change within your own organization.
Boy, that's a really cool theme, and I'm really digging that. Whether it's talking about sort of training or talking about interdepartmental communication, and security approaches and hygiene, all of this kind of coming back to that sort of interconnectivity and nobody really doing it alone, which is a great little microcosm here in this room because we have a wonderful partnership and connection between AWS and Okta. And I want to thank both of you for coming here to tell us a little bit more about it, for giving us some very scary stories and some very scary things that go bump in the night, and then talking to us about how we can, through this wonderful partnership, maybe avoid some of those threats and leave the campfire. And we're gonna have s'mores now. We're gonna leave the scary stories behind. We're into the s'more phase of the night. But thank you so much for being here with us on this for this webinar. I've really enjoyed chatting with you both.
Yeah, likewise.
Same.
Appreciate it.
All right. Well, I hope you all enjoyed sitting around the campfires, telling scary stories and going through all of that with our incredible speakers. Wow, John and Anthony, what a great day. Like I said at the start, no shortage of Halloween puns, which is weird. I'm really not that Halloweeny, but like I said, I'm feeling in the mood. I'm feeling the Halloween energy right now. So thank you all for coming along with me on those scary stories. If you're looking to get a little bit more information from John and Anthony right away, I do want to remind all of you to go back on over to the handouts tab. If you haven't already done that, there's a solution brief there on Okta and AWS, modernizing identity and enhancing security. There's a great ebook, Secure Access Anywhere, Seamless Experience Everywhere, really exploring workforce and customer identity solutions powered by Okta and AWS. Also a free Verizon report on the 2024 data breach investigations. And, oh man, the bug crowd inside the mind of a hacker 2024. I love this. Inside the mind of a hacker. If you have not taken time to read this, please do now. Make sure you've got that downloaded. It is so cool. And it starts out with a definition of hacker and kind of reclaiming that word and not necessarily thinking of the hackers as the bad guys, but maybe the good guys and getting inside their mindset. I highly, highly recommend spending time with all of these handouts. There are some awesome, awesome handouts. Alan says, trick or treat, smell my feet, give me something good to eat. Alan, I got no food for you, my friend. Will you accept ebooks and solution briefs instead? Please visit the handouts tab and eat your full of great information and cool takeaways. That's my gift to you all on behalf of Okta and AWS. Well, on that note, I do want to say a big thank you to everyone for joining us today. Now, before we wrap up, I am going to give away our prize. We do have a $250 Amazon gift card going to someone who is here live and present, and as I always say, maybe a little bit lucky. And that special pre-Halloween winner is Rob Valenti from New Jersey. Rob Valenti of New Jersey, you have won a $250 Amazon gift card, so stay tuned for that. We'll follow up with you after we wrap. Also, don't forget that we had that $50 best question gift card, and the competition was fierce today. So thank you to everyone for getting those awesome questions in. We will make sure to follow up with our best question winner once we've had a chance to read through all of the questions. So congrats to our future winners on that. All right. Well, with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Okta. I want to thank AWS for making this webinar possible, and especially to thank our wonderful speakers, John and Anthony. You've given us so much to think about today. I genuinely had a fun conversation with you, which is surprising when we're talking about scary things that go bump in the night and specters and ghosts and all of that. But I have to say, this was a really fun and enjoyable conversation. I hope that you're all feeling the same way. I hope that you're feeling that sense of calm security. We talked about how in people who like true crime, that a big part of why we watch that or listen to that is that we like to come up with this sort of survival manual of how we can avoid some of those scary stories. So I'm hoping that you're walking away from this session today feeling that you've built that survival manual up for yourself a little bit more, that you have some ideas of how you can avoid some of these pitfalls and not find yourself on the other end of that scary story. So thank you very much for those of you who joined us today and asked questions and participated in that conversation. I hope that I'll get to see all of you at a webinar again soon. And until then, have a beautiful day and happy Halloween tomorrow coming up soon. Talk to you all soon. Thanks.